So can everybody hear me?
Yep. Yes, I can.
Okay. So I guess I'll get started unless there are reasons not to.
No, sounds good.
Go for it.
Okay, so Mailman 3 basically was architected to allow independent development of three faces of Mailman. One which faces the internet mail system, one which faces users and developers, and one which faces the web, basically. And of course, I'm sure you all know that the earliest mailing lists were managed by system managers who actually physically manipulated the lists of addresses that SendMail knew about. They immediately recognized that a more featureful program was needed that didn't require intervention of system administrators. There's a commercial product called Listserv that I think was originally more or less free software, although I'm not sure whether it was free as in speech or whether it was free as in beer. And now it's a commercial product. And then, of course, there was Majordomo. Qmail had its own, was that Smart List, I think? And so on. And they all were basically email oriented. You sent mail to the list, a special address on the list, or sometimes with a special subject, and it would subscribe you, unsubscribe you, tell you who was on the list, and things like that. So in about 1994, the Dave Matthews Band needed a better program for its fan newsletters, and that's when GNU Mailman was born. John Viega is a lesser known but stalwart GNU supporter. So Mailman has always been a GNU project and under the GPL and so on. And he decided to develop it in a somewhat offbeat new programming Python language called Python. And he's still sort of an elder in the Python community, but most people don't know him. I'm not sure what exactly he's actually doing these days. And the basic thing that was an improvement here was it took advantage of the World Wide Web, which had basically started up around then, to provide a more user-friendly interface. So Mailman caught on rapidly among software developers, and probably our most prominent user is the Internet Engineering Task Force. All those RFCs that you hear about, they're all heavily debated using Mailman. By around 2000, there were clear limitations to the original program, and so Barry Warsaw had taken over by then, and he was the lead developer. And he decided that the program needed more extensibility than it had to serve the users that were now piling into the community. And what he did was he created what we now call a pipeline architecture, in which you have a bunch of handlers that the message is passed from one to the next. So it's not an event loop in the sense of going back to the beginning and getting another event, but for each post that comes in, it gets bundled up into a message object, and then it gets passed from one handler to the next, and eventually goes to a handler that distributes it to the list. Some of the things that handlers do are check for spam. If you want to have an anonymous list, you can substitute the list address for the author's address. You can get rid of exes and bat files and things like that that you might not want distributed to naive users. You can convert HTML to text if there's no text part. You can remove HTML parts if you have a text part, and so on and so forth. So you just pass from one to the next, and eventually it comes out the other end. Around 2010, Barry decided to re-architect Mailman again, and there were two goals at that point. One was to get rid of the remaining C code. We had a little bit of C that was basically there to handle changing the user. Some of the stuff that Mailman does used to involve root access. And so you do the little dance of becoming super user and then changing to a relatively permissionless user. We usually recommend Mailman. Debian at least likes to call it list. But the important thing is that it's almost anonymous, and it doesn't even have access to the archives, for example. The other thing he wanted to do in the long run was migrate to Python 3. And so that meant basically rewriting the whole code base anyway. And so he decided to do some re-architecting as well. The core functions of the subscription database and mail distribution followed the Mailman 2 architecture with the pipeline. He split the pipeline into two parts. One, a purely filtering group called the chain. And the idea there was if you detect spam, if you know that the user is moderated or something like that, then you can divert the whole message without changing it to a separate queue. If you pass all the rules and it's decided that the message is going to be distributed, then it goes to the handlers, which do things like munge the addresses. One of the more important ones nowadays is removing AOL and Yahoo users from the from line and replacing them with the list and adding those to the reply to, because otherwise you get in trouble with DMARC and all your users bounce. So that's another kind of thing that Mailman, another service that Mailman provides. So that part he was satisfied with, and it's basically very similar. Most of that code was pretty generic. It didn't require a lot of rewriting to become Python 3 compatible. But the web interface and the archives were another matter. And so what he decided was he would split those out into separate processes, separate programs, and communicate using a web API, and in particular, a RESTful API. So you have your HTTP endpoints, and each endpoint connects to some function that the Mailman core handles. This turns out to be a weakness because Barry was not a crypto guy. And so we basically have no sane authentication feature in Mailman core. And what that means is that you either have to put everything on a single host and then firewall that host, or you have to have a subnet and firewall that, which turns out to be somewhat annoying. There's also problems that we've had with trying to use VMs and things like that. And I'm not sure whether that has to do with Mailman architecture or whether that's just VMs are hard. So he split it into three components. The interface for the archiver is actually very simple. The only thing you really need to know from your archiver is what are the URLs going to be, because you want to put those into the header of the mailing list in order to allow smart MUAs to automatically connect to the archive. And that turns out to be very simple. You have a standard URL and you have some standard way of identifying a message. We thought about just using the raw message IDs, but that turns out to be problematic because a lot of spammy and other not so RFC conscious groups do funny things that are not RFC compliant with the message ID. So we just SHA one, which since this isn't really a cryptographic application, we don't really care. We're just interested in the low collision frequency aspect. And so now you have a URL which is composed of the standard site URL, the name of the mailing list, the posting address. No, I guess it's the RFC list ID. So you have the list ID as the middle component, and then you have the hash of the message ID as the message identifier. And there's a stub in there because sometimes you see the same message ID. For example, the VM MUA that was developed for Emacs has a specific obnoxious fake message ID that it puts in. And some MTAs see that and say, okay, there's a message ID, and so I'm just going to pass this on. And since this is a constant across all instances of VM, sometimes these kinds of things happen. So there's an option for disambiguating these. If you see, we currently don't actually try to detect duplicates other than through message ID because this just doesn't happen much anymore. But at the time, we were worried that that might happen, and so you could also have a subfolder for that ID and then different messages in there. But none of the archivers actually implement that, so we don't bother. The other aspect is the user interface for creating and managing lists and for users to manage their subscriptions. And what we had, one of the organizational problems that we had was that we just didn't have very many people in Mailman. And they were very active in many other things. So what we were seeing was that we were being very reactive and fixing bugs, but we weren't developing very many new features except for Barry off on his own developing this new thing. So one of his goals was to cut the application into smaller pieces, have them talk to each other at arm's length, and allow separate development teams and release cycles. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize today, is that this has actually worked very well for the Mailman community. The developers have gotten even less active over time. We still have, well, we used to have sprints until COVID, but we would have sprints at PyCon every year and usually get a lot done. We also typically participate in Google Summer of Code, and sometimes that stuff turns into an important feature, but only once or twice in about 10 projects, I think. So Mailman, the core is very mature, as I said. It does what needs to be done, and so the incentive to mess with the rest of it hasn't been that great. There's some pressure from users, but it doesn't usually result in code contributions. And so what Barry wanted to do was make it possible for new people to come in, take ownership, and have their own release cycle that was not dependent on Mailman core. The user interface was more important, so Barry had some interest in that, and he recruited some people that he knew, and they developed the user interface application, which is called Pastorius. Barry's a semi-professional bass player, so it's a portmanteau of Post and Pastorius, who is a famous jazz bass player. And they chose Django as the platform, which is why I had some things to say about Django earlier. The archive wasn't so important, and the reason for that is that the archiver for Mailman 2, which really is pretty, I mean, it was functional for a 1998 program, but today you would expect a lot more from a web application. But we could hook that up pretty easily. And we also have better commercial or free services out there like mailarchive.com. And if you figure out the rules that mailarchive.com uses for its per message URLs, then you can plug that in. And it's just a matter of having a very simple handler that mails the post to mailarchive.com, and you're done. So nobody really worried too much about that. And that's where the Fedora project came in. They picked up this because they wanted a web browsable archives with social networking features for their developers. And they provided support for a new project called HyperKitty, mostly personnel. These were paid developers, paid by Red Hat, and they produced the HyperKitty archiver. My personal opinion is that for my use, it's way over-engineered. There are like 4 different layers of databases and caches and things like that that can be in there. But that's what Red Hat wanted, so that's what Red Hat got. The Mailman 3 suite has been in production handling the Fedora and some internal mailing lists of Red Hat since about 2015. So how is the architecture in somewhat more detail? There's 3 applications: the Mailman core, which provides database services to lists and to sites hosted on the server; Pastorius, which is a modern web app interface to subscribers, list administrators, domain administrators, and it's accessed by a conventional web browser. And so we have Pastorius and HyperKitty and a number of support libraries that factor out facilities that are common to 2 or more of the applications, and sometimes are useful to administrators and developers.
Can I ask, like with HyperKitty, do you even need email anymore, or is that just a self-contained thing? Is that even a mailing list anymore?
Oh yeah, there's a mailing list. The mailing lists are so central because HyperKitty doesn't actually process posts itself on the way out. You can post from HyperKitty, but what it is a very simple web app that composes mail and sends it to the mailing list.
So, I mean, how do the social networking features work? It seems like it'd all have to be self-contained in there. Like you'd have to send and view them and do everything from within the app, wouldn't you?
Well, the social networking features, this is the term that the HyperKitty developers used. And what they meant are being able to like archive posts and to add Twitter icons and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
So it's not a social. I mean, mail is a social network, right?
Right.
It's just not. I mean, it's just not a mobile app.
Right. Yeah, I think I understand what they're doing.
So, and you have to remember that with respect to HyperKitty, this terminology comes from about 2013.
Okay.
So, we did have Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that, but the whole social networking thing was not quite as well developed at that point. And I think that's when Jamie wrote his infamous you don't want a program groupware. You want to write a program that helps your users get laid. Post. That was about when that came out. And so that's when people were realizing what social networking really was. What a social network platform could really be.
Right.
So, yeah, so the term social networking is probably not a good idea nowadays. Just minor features that allow you to express approval within the HyperKitty application.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So it's important to understand that Mailman Core does no authentication, as I mentioned earlier. This has implications for scalability in the sense that you have to worry about your network architecture and firewalling and things like that, although it's not a hard constraint. We also do have features that allow you to, we have a number of queues involved in processing the mail. There's an incoming queue, which basically takes the mail and stores it into the pipeline queue, and then the pipeline queue puts it into an outgoing queue, and each one of these has a separate process that handles it. And so basically the idea is that even within Mailman, processing a post is a store and forward process. First, we get it, we confirm that we got the whole thing, we store it somewhere safe, and then we start doing the next operation. So we do have some features that allow you to distribute among multiple queues, and in theory, this is NFS friendly, so you could put the whole queue on a NFS share and have multiple hosts doing it, that kind of thing. So there is some consideration for scalability, but authentication turns out to be a problem because of the need to firewall and things like that, which makes administration annoying to some extent. So this architecture has been very successful in encouraging innovation in the sense that we did get Fedora and Red Hat to come in to develop a completely new archiver. Pastorius was written by a bunch of people who weren't really interested in the email side of it. I'm a pretty hardcore email geek, and so are Barry and Mark, who were the core people at that time. But the people who were working with Pastorius were more interested in web applications and serving users and things like that, rather than making the mail run. So that was successful. Bringing in Fedora was successful. And finally, we now have a commercial service that offers alternative, relatively streamlined administrative and archiver applications. Using the REST interface, it took about 3 man-months for each to go from the letting of the contract. These were developed by independent consulting firm to commercial offerings. Sadly, they were written in PHP, so I'm not sure I would want to use them, but it shows the possibilities. So a slight aside about mailing lists and web forums, because this is a source of a lot of friction in the Mailman community. The fundamental fact about email is that it's asynchronous, and it has a very flexible social network structure because an email can have multiple addresses. Software development and other focused activity generally finds these to be desirable features. You bring in people when you need them. The people who are always active are on the list. But keeping up with a group of lists that are very active can require a lot of energy. And the other thing that happens is that traditionally mailing lists have operated under a set of conventions called netiquette. Things like not top posting and instead using interline comments, which require discipline of posters to trim relevant quoted content and also the interleaving aspect. So, you need to have people who are invested in the mailing list and in its social conventions in order to make this kind of thing work. On the other hand, the channels in web forums are fundamentally synchronous and siloed. It's relatively difficult to move a conversation from one channel in a web forum to another, even if it's the same site. So a web forum has a feel closer to a face-to-face conversation. One of the features that web forums frequently implement is user-based moderation, where, you know, if a post gets liked a lot, then it gets higher up in the recommendations. If it's disliked a lot, then it goes down. If a particular user is always obnoxious, then people can dislike the user, and eventually they will get moderated and perhaps even banned from the forum and that kind of thing. But obviously, this is very difficult to do with email. It's difficult to authenticate email, and all we really have is the user's email address that we can authenticate on. It turns out that using PGP or something like that to sign email is possible, but there are very few people out there who can handle the technology of GPG. GPG is not the crypto for the masses, let's put it that way. So it's just impossible to really successfully moderate a disruptive person. If they want to cause problems, it's very difficult to do anything aside from moderating all the new users, which is what most mailing lists do nowadays. So that kind of thing is often requested, but as far as I can see, it's pretty much infeasible unless you want to move to the web forum model. As I mentioned, the web forum has a feel that's closer to a face-to-face conversation, and a similar effect can be achieved in email chains by top posting. So this seems to be more comfortable for casual or occasional users, and you do see such conversations occurring on mailing lists. TLUG tends to be that kind of thing where you have a back and forth. You don't see lots of heavily branching of threads. But on a development forum, you do see generally very broad trees, as well as a few back and forth kinds of conversations. So the web forum seems designed to achieve the latter, and the mailing list is more oriented towards the former. So there are issues there. On the other hand, we do have the division into the three aspects of running a mailing list. And so if somebody really wanted to do a web forum and integrate it with a Mailman core and try to make that work, we have the architecture for that. So finally, I want to get to the commercial aspect of this. The whole background here is that this is by design, and I hope it's clear that I'm pretty enthusiastic about this design, that I think it's been very successful not only for the Mailman 3 project, but also for the Mailman 3 users, because they've gotten features that we would not have given them, honestly. They're logical extensions of traditional mailing list functions, but we wouldn't have given them to them. I don't think we had the capacity for that. We certainly wouldn't have written a whole new archiver. Most likely, if we had had to provide an archiver for people who insisted on a one-stop shopping experience, we would have taken Piper Mail and improved that somewhat. So The core is very robust, extensible, and scalable, but Pastorius and HyperKitty are not as mature. Pastorius and HyperKitty were both greenfield projects. They basically started from the ground up and did what they thought would make a better user experience. But this causes some problems because good user experiences generally are evolved rather than created. So I want to change screens here for a second. This will take a second because I'm not familiar with this interface. And oops. Okay, so this is the traditional list administrator's view of the membership list. And as you can see, you have the members' addresses, a name for the members. We don't use the name very much, but you could, in theory, build this out into a profile for the user, although for various reasons we didn't do that. And then you can see at the top the various characteristics that you can have. It might be the user might be moderated. They might not want mail. You might want to hide them from a list of the lists. Some users want their mail acknowledged when they send to the list. This is very rare nowadays, but that was an important feature back in the 1990s. We can filter out posts that are also addressed to you. Obviously, if it's a BCC, we can't do that. But if we know you're on the mailing list, then we can filter that out. I personally prefer filtering duplicates at my end rather than at the mailing list end, but this is, again, a feature that a lot of people ask for. And so this is, I don't get my own posts. So it's like Gmail. No dupes is the same thing. If you're CC'd on a post to the list, then that will get filtered out. And then there are options for digest. And finally, the language is the language of the user interface. And for example, you could have Japanese or China on my server. So all of that's in one place. And I'll explain why that's important in a second. So here's the membership list for a Mailman list, a Mailman 3 list. And as you can see, there is pretty much nothing that you can do here. You can check them. I'm not sure what happens what you can do if you do check them. I guess you can CVS export, you can unsubscribe. But those are actually, in my experience, relatively rarely used operations. CSV export, that might be useful, but the unsubscription, not really. So what happens if you go to my address here, then you see all of the stuff, whether I'm currently receiving mail, what kind of mail I'm receiving, whether I get my own posts, whether they're hacked or not, whether my address is hidden, and so on, and where I am in moderation status and my preferred language. Well, this is problematic, right? So what happened recently was a user that is a list administrator had started up a new list, and for the first time they had a bunch of AOL users, I think it was. And they had not set the feature where we replace AOL users whose site has a DMARC P equal reject. They were getting tons of bounces and getting lots of users unsubscribed. And if you were on mailing lists in 2014, you probably remember how crazy it was back then when they first turned on P equals reject for ordinary mailboxes. So what they wanted to do was to moderate everybody really quickly. And they can't do it. This interface doesn't allow it. So they had to go into each individual user, moderate them, and then come back out. Now, this, of course, can be done by a program. We do have the REST API, and obviously if Pastorius is talking to Mailman core, where moderation actually takes place through a REST API, then you can write a program to do this. And in fact, one of the libraries that I mentioned earlier is called Mailman Client, which provides a bunch of Python functions for doing exactly this kind of thing. However, your typical mom and pop list admin doesn't know how to do this. That's why we have the web interface, right? So go back to the original, and this is where I run out of. I just do something stupid. Oh, I see what it did. That doesn't matter. So we have a number of these issues. That particular one was very painful because the person in question had like 3 of these lists, and there were like 500 people involved, and so they spent hours fixing things. But there are a bunch of other similar issues where we did what we thought was a good interface, and it turns out not to work very well. And we gradually fixed those over time, but as I say, manpower is low, so the process is kind of slow. We also tend to want to go to the people who originally wrote the code in order to get their opinions, and they take some time to reply, and so it's not a very efficient process. Then, as I mentioned, many users want more forum-like features in HyperKitty, and so there's a really big problem there that we don't have anybody who really understands the internals at this point. So we kind of have to go, we either have to do a lot of code reading, hi Jason, or we have to ask the people who wrote it. And they're busy people. They're good about getting back, but it doesn't necessarily happen very quickly. And a lot of times they've forgotten and they say, well, I can schedule some time in the summer kind of thing. So that kind of has pretty much stalled completely except for certain kinds of bug fixing. I think one of the things that was a really big deal was that Abalash integrated Elasticsearch, which turns out not to be very good, and Zapier, which turns out to be very good. For some reason, the Red Hat guys had used a different indexer, and as a full text indexer, it turns out that Zapier is more flexible and an order of magnitude faster than whatever they were using before. So we've gotten some stuff done, but there's still a lot of issues, a lot of little things that we could do that are sitting in the bug tracker, basically. So Okay, so much for preparation. That's the end of the prepared part. So what happened was there's a company called EMWD, and they provide some web hosting, but one of their big features is specifically hosting mailing lists. And they've been using Mailman 2 for, I think, 15 years now. The lead guy, I guess he's CAO, is a guy named Brian. And Brian can be testy. He can be really snippy on the list and stuff like that. But basically, he's been a really good citizen. So, we have our little spats occasionally, but every time he comes back and every time we come back and start to cooperate again. So this was not a hostile fork kind of thing, right? But he was looking at the situation, and he had a couple of things in the queue that just weren't getting done. He doesn't program himself, at least not very much. And so he couldn't get the stuff that he wanted done. And he was, as someone who manages sites and domains for his users, and also does a fair amount of consulting, he has really good insight into what his users want. So if you look at the Mailman lists, however, who do you see there? Well, you see a lot of large site managers. I'm not sure whether Apple still runs their mailing lists on Mailman or whether they use Mailman 2 or Mailman 3, because the guy who used to participate actively is no longer showing up on the list. But at one point, they had a Mailman list with 5 million people on it. So when Chip showed up, we paid attention. If he wanted something, we knew that there were 5 million people out there who would benefit from it. We have a guy from New Zealand at the University of Wellington and another guy at the University of Washington in Seattle, who have, I think it was 8,000 and 25,000 mailing lists, respectively, running on Mailman 2. And they're both looking to move to Mailman 3, but obviously that's a huge job. So these are our core clients, as it were. And the small mom and pop lists, like TLUG actually, they just kind of run, right? I haven't seen anybody complain about anything on TLUG except for reply to list. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that the only person I've seen complain about that is me. So there you go. It just works. And so for somebody like Brian, who is serving a lot of less technical, TLUG people are pretty much technical out the wazoo, right? We know what can be done, we know what can't be done. And if we want something done, we do it ourselves, kind of thing. But for people who are running a neighborhood moms list or the PTA list or something like that, they go to somebody like Brian. So he knows what they want. He knows what they need. He knows what they're not getting. And he said to himself, well, the Mailman people are nice people, but they're not very responsive. We do a lot of responding to how to do this on the list, and sometimes we make it easier. But in terms of providing new features, not so much. And he said, well, if I fix some of these things, I can make some money here. I can get a competitive advantage over other Mailman hosting services. And so that's what he did. In the spring of 2020, he first went to go for Postorius for the web interface for list and subscription management. And he decided that that was the obvious target because that's where his clients were, right? His clients were running simple mailing lists. They were mostly satisfied with the mailing list. Archives were not a big priority for him at the time. And so he went to a contractor, and the contractor said, it's 3 months and some $10,000s. I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars it was offhand. But it wasn't very expensive, right, in terms of software development. 3 man months and, I don't know, $50,000 or something like that. It's just not a lot of money. Not these days, anyway. And so he developed a his affinity management interface, and that's basically what happened there. And this was pretty successful in the betas, and some of the people in the betas who are more active users, more into the whole mailing list scene, said, you could do better than HyperKitty. And so he went back to his contractor, and this was basically at the end of the beta period for Affinity, and the contractor said, oh, I can do that. And so now he has Empathy, which is his archiver. The interesting thing about Empathy is not that it's a forum. That's not what people wanted as far as he was concerned. And Empathy basically streamlines some of the things. It makes it easier to authenticate. If you use the thing about HyperKitty and Pastorius is that they have separate password databases. You're not the same Django user because these are completely arm's length applications. And since Mailman Core doesn't have authentication at all, not for users and not for the applications, there's no way to communicate in the current architecture of Mailman, which is a major design bug in my opinion now that I've come to work with it and think about it for a while. But that's the way it works. And so what he did was he has his Empathy and Affinity communicating, and so now if you are a password person rather than a social auth person, you can use one password easily for all of your Affinity and Empathy activities. So those were the big improvements that he made. And I think he spent some money on CSS, and it looks a little bit slicker than ours because I think that our people spent more effort on accessibility than on making it look good. And
Are Affinity and Empathy, so he's keeping those proprietary then?
And yes, he's keeping those proprietary. Those are his competitive advantage in what is a fairly active Mailman hosting industry. Brian is the best citizen of the bunch. He is on the lists pretty much at least once a week, basically. Most of the time, he's helping other users. Sometimes he's got feature requests or whatever, but mostly he's there to help. And he also advertises his hosting service.
That's a good way to do it. So I guess his feature requests and stuff are geared towards the core then, obviously, because he's not using the UIs anymore, right?
Well, no, he's actually he still says, I have users who want some of the things that are in Pastorius that I'm not going to provide in Affinity Empathy. As I said before, they're streamlined. So the idea is very few screens with everything you need on them, right? It's obvious what you need. It's obvious what you need to click on in order to do the job that you want to do. That's the purpose of these. So, for example, in Affinity, you have one level of fallback. In the you have a user who can subscribe to multiple lists, and then you have the subscription. In Postorius, there's about 5 different levels. There's a hard-coded fallback for pretty much any of the things that would happen. There is a list fallback. There is the user's preference. There is the user's preference for a particular email that the user uses. And then you can even specify things for the subscription. So for example, a lot of people use their display name to indicate the use of the address. So for example, a lot of people will have Steve at TLUG, and that's going to be the username. So I'll have some additional junk on my email address that I use for delivery, and I can identify that that's the address being used very easily because it's Steve at TLUG in the display name. And typically when you reply, the display name just gets copied, right? So if you reply to me at that address, then I don't need to investigate the address itself. Just by looking at who you mailed it to, I know that you got my address from TLUG. So people actually do use this feature of changing some of their options by subscription, by email address, and of course, most of the time, most people have a particular set of options that they want used for all of their subscriptions. Affinity doesn't have that. It just has the user level and the subscription level. And the site level is implemented as a standard initialization for users. So it is really streamlined. It has the features that the most people want. But from Brian's point of view, being able to offer better Postorius and better HyperKitty to certain of his clients is going to be a plus for him. So yeah, I think this is, one of the most socially responsible business models I've seen in a long time. So, the bottom line here, and I think it would be interesting to discuss, is that from my point of view, the success of Mailman 3 is going to be dependent on this division into the 3-part architecture, and that we're already seeing substantial success in terms of large investments from external development organizations. The development of HyperKitty in particular went on for about 3 years, and those developers were, I think there were a total of 3 of them, and they were spending about half time on HyperKitty. So, and Red Hat is not a place that tends to bind the mouths of the pigs that tread the corn either. So I expect that costs them quite a bit of money.
So are they not maintaining it? I mean, they developed it and they're using it and they don't continue adding features or anything like that?
No, they're so last year was obviously completely broken. Up until that point, every summer, one of the guys would show up on the mailing list and engage with us. And about every other year, he would do some work, usually on something that Red Hat wanted.
Okay.
But, it's open source. That's the way these things work. And we wouldn't have anything like it if it hadn't been for Red Hat in the first place. It's, and as I say, we have done some substantial work on it. The indexing thing was a real pain point for people with large lists not large lists, but large archives that they were moving. The problem is that there are some minor glitches that have to do with handling of non-conformant email in Mailman 2 and Mailman 3. And so something that got into the archive in Mailman 2 might trigger a somewhat stricter interpretation of the RFCs in Mailman 3. And most of the time we catch that, but somehow there's always a new way to screw up email.
Yeah, that sounds like the eternal problem with this type of software to me is just things that almost conform to the RFCs, but once in a while don't. That seems like just a major uphill battle.
Yeah, it is. We've gotten better at trapping that stuff, and I don't think we've seen a Unicode exception in Mailman 3 in like 5 years.
Wow, that's good.
So we've gotten that one pretty much under control. And that was originally a Python issue anyway. Python 2 used bytes for normal strings. So if you had ASCII or if you had a unibyte encoding like Latin 1, then you could just use the old str string data type. And it was only when you wanted to do Japanese or Vietnamese or Arabic. Well, Arabic, I guess, has a 1 byte thing, but they prefer Unicode. And there are a couple of other languages that prefer Unicode, even though they have 1 byte encodings. And then you'd had to use the Unicode internal string type. And converting between those two, you had lots of double conversions or failed conversion problems. You'd get, well, mojibake, and you'd get things that just couldn't be done and get exceptions and things like that. And then we changed over to Python 3, which has a true string type, a Unicode-based string type, and a additional bytes thing. You can't get a double encoding in Python 3 because strings don't have a decode method, and bytes don't have an encode method. If it's encoded, it's in bytes. You decode and you get a string. If it's a string, which is text, then you can encode it and you get bytes. And so no more double decode problems, and you get an obvious exception if you try to feed bytes to something that wants a string. So the whole architecture of the Python ecosystem was involved in that particular problem. But email is a really hairy medium to work with. And that's one reason why people prefer doing things on the web.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, especially proprietary forums where you've got control over everything, you don't have to deal with a lot of those kind of issues.
Well, one of the big issues with email and the RFCs and all of that is that it's often explicit as to how it does work, but people don't want it to work that way or wish it didn't. So they just use that feature, but not following the RFC. So as an example, in MIME, you can set up an email that says it's a multi-part alternative. You can look at the HTML content or the text content. Either one is a substitute for the other. But then most of the messages I get that have the alternative to the HTML is a very short text string that says, this cannot be viewed in text form. Which, of course, even though I'm perfectly capable of viewing HTML, because they said in the headers, text is just as good as HTML for this email, I see or worse yet, it says, you cannot view HTML. Right?
Right.
Which is an utter lie. Of course, I could view it. Just don't tell me the text is also an alternative to it.
Yeah. Well, worse than that is Apple Mail's habit of embedding attachments in the HTML.
How do they do that?
Well, you can. There are a bunch of tags like object and source.
Oh God,
and things
okay.
like that,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And so instead of embedding it as a MIME object and referring to it by content ID, they embed it in the HTML. And so if you have a mail program that wants to if you want to save a file, for example, it can't find it because it's not part of the MIME structure.
Well, you're supposed to be using your HTML program renderer to save the stuff in that case, right? It's actually
Except if
still
they do
following the standards.
Except if they do it inline, then you can't save it at all. So, yeah, I mean, you
Sure,
can
just
say,
right. Like if you get an image that's a instead of source equals blah blah blah, it's whatever the data equals long hex string thing. You should just be able to right click on it and save as.
you should.
Right. At any rate, they are following the standard. They're just not following the standard you wish they were following, which is slightly different from just not following the standard but pretending you are.
Oh, you mean like abusing reply to?
Yeah, that kind of thing. You know, I mean, basically, if someone's following a standard, but you don't, it's not the one you wish they were using, it, you at least have the opportunity to work around that. Like you might modify MUT to be able to hand the HTML to an external program, which would then return a list of all the separate, or a set of all the separate objects extracted from that HTML document, and then be able to use it within its thing. But when you've got somebody, you know, saying I'm using this standard when they're not, and doing something exactly not what they're saying they're doing by using that standard, not much you can do about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Although the example that you give with the text and the HTML, the one you can't view HTML. Now that is that deserves a clue back to the head. But, I mean, that's just rude. But this message must be viewed in HTML, at least as telling you what's going wrong, which for naive users is
right. Well, if I recall correctly, though, there's another. You can put a text attachment on that says that, and it should work fine according to the standard. Just don't say it's an alternative to the HTML. That's the issue that I have with that.
I'm not sure how you would set that up in mind. So there's a prelude in MIME, which is the text above the MIME content, and some MUAs will display that, but many won't, because it's in some sense not there. It's a comment.
Right. To anything interpreting MIME.
Yeah. So anything that interprets MIME properly may not see that at all. If you have a text plain part and then followed by a HTML part, I'm not sure.
Well, it should display both.
Yeah. Okay.
If it's
so
just
it
straight that.
It should just display the text part properly, and then some MUA specific message about there's an HTML part here, but I don't know what to do with it. Save it to disk or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one way of doing it would be to put the HTML part first, and then below that, a text part that says, if you are having difficulty reading this, blah, blah, blah. Right, and that would just be displayed below the HTML.
That doesn't work, though. That doesn't work according to the standard, and here's the reason. The last of... Oh, wait, no, it does work. Okay, that does work. It's the alternatives where order matters, in the sense that only one of them gets displayed.
Exactly.
But for the mixed part, they both get displayed. The only problem... Well, there's another problem, though, and that is that text parts are supposed to be displayed. Text star should be treated as text plain if you can't do anything else. So
right, which is why we have the alternative thing, so you don't display all this HTML that's saying the same thing as the plain text in a human, more or less unreadable format.
Right. So the thing is that if you've got a Microsoft-based MUA sending the mail and you put that first, what you're going to get is a megabyte of CSS and heavily classified and named HTML content and about 3 lines of texts.
Right.
Embedded in there in ways that are really unclear. So,
well, it should be pretty easy because
I don't know if people are actually going to scroll to the bottom of that, man.
Oh, you don't. If you're doing alternative, you don't need to. Oh, I see what you mean. If you do it with the just this one after the other to try.
Right.
And,
so the text part that says, if you are not viewing in HTML, this message will be garbage. Would have to come on top. But that's not very nice either. So, yeah, the right thing, of course, is to provide a proper text part. So, does anybody else have any comments or whatever? I was estimating it would take me about 20 minutes, but I wasn't sufficiently prepared, so it took me 40 minutes or so, and here we are more than an hour in. So if anybody else has any comments,
I thought Christian put his hand up about something.
Sure.
Yeah, there, Christian?
Oh, well, we're waiting for him. I was going to ask, it should be possible actually to run multiple admin interfaces on the same Mailman list, right?
It should be possible to run. Oh, yeah. You could, but you run into the auth problem, right? I'm not sure you'd want to do that. I mean, in fact, in practice, we do run multiple admin on it. If so, like when we add a new REST endpoint to the core, obviously old Pastorius won't know about that. And so if we don't coordinate between upgrading Pastorius and upgrading the core, if we add a new REST endpoint, the way you do that is you go in to the host, you log in, and you take the shell and fire up a Python import Mailman client and manipulate the REST endpoint that way. So yeah, you could do that. I'm not sure why you'd want to.
Well, for somebody like the guy providing commercial services, if I were buying that, I might want to, at some point, switch from using the easy interface, but easy but less powerful interface, to the more powerful one, or have it available there just to do stuff that's hard to do in the easy interface.
Yeah, that you can definitely do. Switching
and is the auth problem just that the authentication for administrators is entirely the province of the admin application and the core knows nothing about it?
That's it, yeah.
Right.
So you'd have to move the auth database.
So it might
Of
make
course.
sense actually to move that to the core at some point,
Yeah.
or have
Yeah,
just
Barry
a
just
third
wanted to
application
avoid that.
or a fourth application. Yeah.
Yeah, Barry just wanted to avoid that because it
Yeah.
wasn't his
Oh, I can see why.
specialty. And Django already does that. So once we had settled on Django, okay, let's delegate that to Django and we won't
Yeah.
worry about it, kind of thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
And for Brian's stuff, I just hope nobody ever does anything high value using Affinity. Because the PHP is still a byword.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Great. So regarding Red Hat and Mailman, 10 years ago when I was joining Red Hat, we were all internal on Mailman 2 and the world was fine. And more people were looking into web forums, and this was when the big push towards Kitty was coming in. And I think a part of the Red Hat contributions was motivated by we need something more web forum for people who like to use web forums. I see that also the Fedora forums are nowadays migrated since 5 years or something already to Mailman 3. Unfortunately, like 5 years ago, someone brought in services from Google, and then there is this thing once someone is paying money per user, they have this, you can use all of our services. So probably at some point there was a decision to rather than run own infrastructure. So we still have a Mailman 2, I think, around. And in parallel, Google Mail groups, Google groups are used. And I guess this has driven down the activities from Red Hat. But I see in Fedora, at least, Fedora is completely on Mailman 3. This is a good thing. I was just a bit wondering also about the separation of how providers who are for customers running Mailman 3, how they try to separate themselves from Google. I mean, they can say, you can promise us we try to not really read your email as Google is doing, or at least we are running open source. You can read the basics and the services, the code behind the services we run for you. But I'm wondering what customers are thinking about this.
I'm not really sure about the general industry, but for Brian, it's the personal service aspect. You know, you actually, when you call support, you actually get support. And that's not true for, you know, ordinary people for Google. If it's not in the forums and stuff like that, you're not gonna get support. You know, the whole point of Google is that it's, you know, artificial intelligence, and so even though they have a huge number of employees, the number of employees per, you know, usage is still very low for Google.
That's right, and I think this is a really strong point. Actually, I'm remembering. So they also started to use Gmail services for a part of the employees, and I think it's even the default for new employees, while I'm still running on open source infrastructure. But as soon as you have a complaint, even though you are paying the service, you do not feel as if you have a voice. So people who hate the Gmail web interface, they get a kind of restricted IMAP interface. But then you cannot really run own mail filters, and yeah, you're right. And the service thing is definitely then a big difference, right? Good point.
Actually, I've got a bit of clarification on that. Being a using Google's business services myself, I use Google Apps for work, or no, I mean Google Workspaces, whatever the hell they're calling it now. And their support is good for the stuff they decide to support well. I mean, I can get a response back in 5 or 10 minutes usually from the business support guys. But I don't think that Groups is on their list of stuff they really heavily support for their business users, for Google Workspace. And especially, I think they are probably not providing much support when you're really trying to do stuff for people who are not paying their $5 a month per user, or users that are not on the, they're not getting $5 a month for. So yeah, if you've just got a dozen users or 10,000 users who are using Gmail, you'll get fine support for that. They'll just expect your users to go through whoever your account contact is before you go to Google for technical support. But if you're using some of their other services, you may or may not get support for that.
Right. Yeah. So the kinds of people who are using Mailman hosting services are mostly tech adjacent people who, for one reason or another, don't want to work with one of the big companies for one reason or another. And for this kind of these small communities, it's really important to them that somebody listens to them. And that's a big problem with the business-oriented services, is that the contract defines what they're going to listen to. And typically the things that people have problems with are not necessarily the things that that the business wants the contract to listen to. Especially when you're talking about ordinary users of a mailing list or something like that. If the list admin is not really familiar with all of the MUAs out there, right? One of the more common things that comes up on the mailing list is user X is having problems reading mail from user Y. And it turns out that user X and user Y have two different MUAs, and they see something differently. Typically, the sending one is doing something non-conformant. But sometimes it's just that the user Y has a very bad MUA or something like that. And Google's not going to help you with that. But that's a large part of these mom and pop mailing lists.
Thanks. Yeah.
So I have one more question if we have time.
Yeah.
At the beginning, you said, Dave Matthews Band kind of spawned off Mailman. I mean, how did they end up spawning off a, open source GNU project?
Viego was a Dave Matthews Band fan. I
mean, did he offer to create the mailing list? Was he not involved with them? He just did it?
I don't know. He was involved with them. He was probably a groupie or something like that,
Okay.
And they were saying we need to do this, but Major Domo doesn't make it.
Okay, interesting.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, it was just he happened to be in the right place at the right time. He had the skills, they had the needs, and or they had the itch and he scratched it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they didn't necessarily commission a GNU project; it just worked out that way.
No, he was just a GNU kind of person.
Right.
Pretty radical, copyleft kind of person.
Okay.
And that's another thing that motivated Barry in some ways, I suspect, is that Mailman Core is kind of self-contained. The mail comes in, the mail goes out, and if he could figure out a way to partition that off, then the other things could be not GPL if people wanted it that way.
Right.
And Barry, when I met Barry, he was a pretty strong GNU supporter, but between the XEMAX, EMAX schism and some other misbehavior by the estimable Mr. Stallman, he became less happy with that. And he was also seeing how well Python was working out as a non-copyleft environment. So at one point there was some discussion of rewriting Mailman entirely and moving to a Python compatible, a Python license compatible license, but that never went anywhere. On the other hand, what he did do made it possible for Mailman for a Mailman suite to include completely proprietary software.
It's probably fine that way. I mean, having the core be GPL is probably no big deal, you know.
No, it's not. As I say, it's completely self-contained.
Yeah.
And it's what we're good at, so we actually do fix that thing and improve it.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a good structure.
So,
All right. Well, it's
Yeah.
fine if you're not a big GPL fan. But the whole
Right.
point of the GPL is really to stop people from doing things like that in its
yeah,
more
it's cultural
extreme forms.
imperialism.
I mean,
all
this
about
is why
cultural
the
imperialism.
classic example, of course, is the Big Num library, which is not LGPL, but is GPL, forcing you to open source your entire freaking program if you want to use big nums in it from that library. And there have been a zillion complaints about it, but the guy came right out and said, you know, I put too much work into big num to give it away for free. Yeah, ironically enough.
Yeah, but you know, Stallman has been saying that for a long time, basically.
Oh yeah, it's always been his thing. Yeah.
You know, it's
Except when he starts talking about free.
Well, it's actually when he talks about free, you get the same vibe in a lot of cases. It's when he talks about commercial, right?
Well, I don't know, because like free beer, I think, as you get it and you can drink it or throw it out or do whatever the heck you want with it, right? But there may be some conditions on it. Free speech seems to me no conditions. I can speak whatever I want, but once you use a bit of GNU code in your software, you no longer have that freedom to, well, not speak in this case.
Yeah.
You have the freedom. You
Yeah.
just, you can.
I think Stallman is quite clear that the GPL is explicitly trying to restrict freedoms, individual freedoms, in order to provide more software for the group and more openness for the group overall. But he doesn't really sell it that way when he's talking about this stuff.
They would probably say that's just a hack around the copyright laws, right? Ideally, maybe there would be no copyright laws and you wouldn't need that.
No.
No?
He likes copyright laws because he can use them explicitly to force you to make speech you might otherwise not want to make.
I mean, if that's really his position, then, you know, that's definitely not free. That's less
Yeah,
free.
he's very clear about it. It just gets sold in what I think is kind of
Yeah, but that's
Slightly
not the way
misleading,
freedom works, guys. That's not the way freedom works. My freedom to thrust out my fist ends at your nose.
Of course, but I mean, copying software doesn't involve anybody's fist in anybody's nose.
No, but the point is, the point here is that there are various different freedoms involved. And so for example, there's also a freedom of association. I want to share something that I have with a particular person, but I don't want it to be shared with other people. I should be free to do that.
You can be free
And
to not
if
want it to be shared, but you're not free to stick your fist into their nose if they do share it.
No, I'm not. No, but I'm free to ask the government to do that.
Well, it's the same thing, though.
No, it's not.
Whether you do it or whether you get your buddies to gang up
No,
on
it's
them.
look. The point is that I can ask Kurt to make a promise not to share my software with somebody else. And morally, if he makes that promise and I share, he should be required to do that. If he turns around
Well,
and
see,
says
I'm
that-
fine with that, but I would say that you are no longer giving away your software for free if you say, hey, Kurt, you can use this, but only if you do these things for me.
Right, and Stallman acknowledges that.
Yeah.
Right.
But I find
But-
in the
but
overall
point is- the
sales
point
of
is that-
GPL,
The point about Stallman and Freedom, Stallman and Friedman, Stallman and freedom. I thought you'd like that. The point about Stallman and freedom is that he believes that by doing this, he maximizes freedom for everybody.
How does that work?
The
By
people who-
reducing freedom, he's maximizing freedom. I
Yes.
guess.
Because freedom, my freedom to do something basically amounts to a right to do that thing. And my right to do something is often going to be in conflict with your right to be free from that something.
Okay, so by what metric do you use to say this one is, a higher value than that one, and so
That I'm not going to get into. You'd have to
yeah,
ask
well, see,
Stallman.
this is what it is. I mean, this so-called maximizing freedom, this is a massive value judgment about,
Yes.
trading off the freedom to do this for not having the freedom to do that kind of thing.
Well,
And if you
fair
ever
enough.
interact with Stallman, what you'll discover is that his freedom is to be maximized, and otherwise he's a control freak.
Oh, okay. Well, I can accept that. I agree precisely with that, except with me in the position of Stallman.
Indeed.
Well, anyway,
So I guess we should move on. If you want to talk about this, you know where to find me. My email address is all over the place. Well,
yeah, I think we're pretty off topic at this point.
Lightnings.
But anyway, thanks for.
Yeah, we may want to shut down that. Do you have another presentation, or?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Andreas is talking next.
All
Well,
right.
the other thing too is once the presentation's over, maybe if people want to talk, we can move back to Gathertown.
So I'd like to ask, do people want to hear my presentation? Because we've been hanging out for quite a while already. Like if people are tired, then I can always do it next time. But if people are still up for it, then I'll do it.
What's it on?
Yeah,
It's about Lilypond, which is not a programming language, but well, a language in which to define music and then compile that into sheet music.
All right.
I-
Well,
I'm
that
good.
does sound like it could go long, but
Well,
I'm not
when I rehearsed it, it was about 45 minutes.
okay.
Save it for next
Well, I don't know. I'm interested in hearing, but I mean, I guess who else is going to stick around?
I'll stick around.
yeah, I'll be
I'm
around.
curious.
I'm less likely to be at the next one, so
Yeah.
I guess I'd vote for doing it now.
Okay, let me set up then. Okay, so before I'm going to talk about Lilypond, I actually have a few slides prepared to introduce myself. I think most people here already know me, but just in case, well, I'm from Belgium. I've been living in Japan for about 11 years now, and I've been using Linux since I think it was 2006 or 7. I was working, I was in college at the time and got an internship at Opera Software, the web browser. They just handed me an Ubuntu PC to work on and, let me figure it out. That was a lot of fun for me. It actually kind of reinvigorated my interest in IT, and so I soon installed it at home and Then moved on to Linux Mint after that, shortly after to Arch Linux. That's been my distribution of choice since then. And for work, I'm a programmer. I used to work over here at Axu. What we did over there was mainly virtualization, like software-defined networking, infrastructure as a service, that kind of stuff. So basically, things similar to, let's say, OpenStack, although our software was out just 2 weeks before the first version of that. But yeah, stuff like AWS, except it's all open source. You can put it in a box and take it home with you. After about 8 years over there, I was ready for something new in my life, and also the main software suites that I had been working on were being retired, and it was just a good cutoff point. I started working for Digica instead. Digica, as you can see on the slide, has a couple of business ventures, but I'm working on the online payments. I already mentioned while we were hanging out earlier that it's a Ruby on Rails application. It's called Komoju, and it's basically a payment gateway. So imagine if you have a web store and you want your customers to be able to buy stuff from you, obviously, then Komoju can give them ways to do that. So if you implement Komoju on your web store, then people become able to buy from you using credit cards or PayPay, LinePay, or even just go to 7-Eleven and pay over there. You get a whole plethora of payment methods that people can then use in your store. And we're actually being used by a couple of really big names in the gaming industry, like Steam, for example. If anyone has ever, if there's any PC gamers over here, I'm sure you're familiar with buying games on Steam. There's also Razer, the gaming hardware vendor, and Blizzard, another very famous gaming company, like the authors of Diablo and World of Warcraft. And outside of the gaming industry, there's also this huge K-pop idol band called BTS, which is using Komoju. Actually, they managed to take it down once because they had a flash sale without telling us, and all of their screaming fans started buying things all at the same time, and we got a whole bunch of traffic. Unfortunately, they were cool about it. We identified the bottleneck and fixed it, and have since survived many larger flash sales, so everything's okay now. Other than work in my free time, I also played guitar in a metal band. Before Corona, we used to play live about twice a month in general. Now it's a lot less. We still do the occasional gig, which is usually live streamed. But instead of playing live, we've been focusing on recording a lot more, and we actually released our first EP back in January, which was a lot of fun. Used a lot of Linux in the recording as well, but that could be a whole other presentation. Well, actually, it couldn't be because it wasn't that interesting. It's mainly just finding hardware that works on Linux, and meat and potatoes of it all is knowing which microphones to use, how to set it up. So Linux is just there to take in data. But
There are
today,
people interested in that.
I actually already talked about it once before, where I set up my audio workstation, did some stuff with it, probably went way too long and bored some people, but Michael, who shows up pretty often, he said to him it meant a lot, and he learned a lot from it and started recording himself at home and trying to become a bit of a one-man band. So yeah, I could always talk about it if people are interested. But today I want to talk about Lilypond. Like it's written over here, it's music notation software. I was just wondering, are there many people here who can read music? If not, then that's okay. Well, of course, Lilypond is really strongly tied into sheet music because it's a language that compiles into sheet music. It's kind of similar to Markdown in that way. Actually, it's not really a programming language, but I think many people here are familiar with Markdown. It's a text-based file format, that then compiles into a nice-looking document. It's often used on GitHub. It becomes a document that you might expect to see more in something like LibreOffice, except it's saved as a text file. It's not saved as a binary format, and so you can manage it in Git. This is very similar, except it's for music notation. And so you actually have to know a little bit about music notation to properly use Lilypond, but there's two concepts that are actually very simple. I can probably explain those really quickly, and then you can see how they translate into Lilypond. So there's pitch and there's rhythm. First, I'd like to talk about pitch a little bit. So pitch is very simple. It's just a sound that's higher or lower than another sound. You write that like this. So I don't know if you guys are able to see my mouse pointer, but you have these 5 lines, which is called a staff. Then these notes on there. All that's to it is a lower note will be written lower on the staff, and a higher one will be written higher on the staff. So the lowest one we have down here is Do, and then we go all the way up to a higher one, which is Do again. That's a topic we could get into, well, that I will explain later about why the same one returns. But one more thing before we dive into Lilypond is the note naming, which is different in different languages. So the ones over here, I'm sure we all know from the movie The Sound of Music, like Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. But there's other ways to name these same notes, and depending on which language you're using, it's going to be different. And Lilypond actually allows you to use many different languages. You can just write at the top of your text file which one you're using. But by default, it uses these in the middle here. That's the English one, C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. So I'm actually going to write a little Lilypond now, opening my terminal over here. If the font is too small and you can't read it, just let me know, I'll increase it. Let's make a new file here. Call it tlug.ly. Open this in Vim. And I'm just gonna turn off my spell checker because it doesn't like Lilypond. So set no spell. First I'm going to try to just write exactly this, these same notes. So in Lilypond, you do it like this, curly brackets. You use this English notation here in the middle. So C dash, D dash, E dash. And I'll explain what the dashes are for later. So E, F, G, A, B, and C dash dash. No file name? Oh yeah, because I just opened NeoVim without giving it a file name, so. Oh, W. File exists, okay. There we go. And now we got some syntax highlighting too. So let's open a new terminal and call Lilypond tlug.ly. This compiles it into a file, tlug.pdf. Let's open this in my browser. I think I need to give it a directory name as well. So. And there we go. So it took this code and compiled it into the same notes that we have over here in the presentation. Or rather these ones, because I added in the upper Do as well. That brings me back to what are these things? What are these little, whatchamacallit, apostrophes? Why do I have 2 over here? People who know music probably already know why, but there's a low Do over here, and then there's a high Do or high C over here. This is what's called octaves. You have these 7 notes, Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si. Well, actually, technically, you have 12 ones because a bunch of them also have notes in between. That's the black keys on a piano, but that's not important right now. But so you have these 7 ones, but of course, the frequency spectrum that's audible to the human ear is a lot broader than just that. So you can go higher and you can go lower than just those 7 notes. And when you do that, the same notes repeat. And that's what's called different octaves. And so what's going on over here, these little apostrophes, they decide which octave a note is in. So I've put all of these in 1 octave. And then here, I have the final C in a higher octave. And let's say after that, I want to write another note. Don't really matter which one. Let's say B. And I can also do this, put in a comma instead. And this means a lower octave. We compile this again. Now we got a very low one. And whoops, wrong tab. How many octaves are there like this? So this is a little chart of the frequencies that different animals are able to hear. At the bottom over here, you have the octaves. So you have the note C or Do, numbers of octaves that it is in. And over here in purple, you have the frequency range that's audible to the human ear. And so it's from the first octave about to the 10th. So we have about 10 octaves that humans can hear and that we can write music in. And of course, the very high ones and the very low ones will not be used so often, but in any case, this is what you have available to yourself as a musician. And one more thing I want to say about writing octaves in Lilypond. This is actually a pretty annoying way of writing it because you have to write it for every single note. But when you're making music, usually you would not be doing this. Like you would usually use notes that are actually pretty close to each other in pitch. You're not going to take one note from one octave and then suddenly take another one that's a couple of octaves down. Like you can do that if you want to, but often that will sound really abrupt. So you'd only use that if you want to surprise the listener, if you want to kind of shock them a little. Usually you want like a more kind of flowing melody that kind of the user can settle into. Calling them users, of course, I mean listener. You can use this statement, relative. And then get rid of all of these things.
Have you ever said that in a concert, called everybody users?
No. In a concert, I usually just pretend to be some kind of demon and I talk in this kind of a voice about how I'm going to take the audience through on a journey through hell. I usually don't call them users. In my nervousness, I changed them all to commas, but let's just remove them like this.
He gives them a much more demeanor name.
Yeah, well, actually, I call them the chosen ones. I'm like, and then our drummer hits a button and like a big church bell plays behind me. It's lots of fun playing live. But so what this relative keyword does, it says whenever you type a note, you want to look at the note that came before it. And then pick the version of the next note, which is closest to it. Like it could be below it or it could be above it. Here we are going from C to D. So we'll pick the D that's above C. We won't go an octave below. And what I've written right now should be a little different from what we've written before. Because before we had a bunch of these kind of going up gradually and then suddenly one went down. But if we refresh now, we don't have the sudden drop at the end anymore because each of these notes over here are checking like where was the note before me. let's take, for example, this E over here. Let's say we want to bring this one up 2 octaves, while all the rest are only up 1 octave, because we have this apostrophe over here. And then compile this. So first we have the C, and we say explicitly which octave we want this one to be in. Then the next one does not have an explicit one, so it looks at the previous one and says, oh, I'm close to this note, so it's drawn here. And then the next one says explicitly, I'm in a higher octave, so that one goes up here. And then the next all gets drawn like relative to this one. So yeah, that's basically it. I'm going to remove this to get like a bit of a cleaner score to work with before I move on to the next topic. And the next topic I want to talk about is rhythm. And what do you think of when you hear rhythm? Like, it's already kind of shown in this image. It's a recurring pulse, a pulse that recurs at different intervals. And when you're listening to music, it's the beat. Like, it's the thing that makes you want to move, that kind of like you start bobbing your head, tapping your feet. It's like this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's also a reason why I'm counting to 4. Because in most Western music, you write in a 4/4 time signature. That means that a group of 4 beats is considered one measure. The whole music is based around that. It's definitely possible to change that. There are some bands, musicians that really love changing a time signature, like Pink Floyd, Dream Theater, like those guys absolutely love to make the rhythm complicated. But standards, like most commonly, it's 4 beats, one measure. And actually, our entire system is based on that, like the way you notate rhythm and how you call different notes of different lengths. Even if you change the time signature, it's still based on one measure is 4 beats. And so when we were looking at pitch over here, these little balls on the notes, they're called note heads. Then where they are in relation to those 5 lines, the staff, is how high they are. And rhythm, how long they continue, like how long they sound, is decided by 1, if they are solid black or if they are more like a donut. Second is if they have a stem and what kind of a stem they have. So this one up here, this is a whole note, and a whole note means it takes up an entire measure. And like I said before, a measure is 4 beats. That's why you call this a whole note. And so the length of this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. During that whole time, this note would be playing. Then here you have half notes, which is only half a measure, which means a measure is 4 beats, so that's 2 beats. So 1, 2. That's the length of half a note. And then these quarter notes, you can probably see over here that this is the note length that Lilypond defaults to. So, and this here is a measure line. So 4 of these in one measure, they take exactly 1 beat. And you can go even further, like the 8 notes over here. There's 8 of those in one measure, which means they take up half a beat. So you don't count these like 1, 2, 3, 4 anymore. You count them like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then 16 notes, 16 in one measure, 4 per beat. So that's like 1 and then a 2 and then a 3 and then a 4 and then a. And the way you write these in Lilypond is very simple. So because we didn't write any duration in here, it defaults to 4th notes or quarter notes. And that's the same as writing a 4 here everywhere. So when we compile this, there should not be any change. And indeed there isn't. But let's say we want this first one to be a whole note that takes up an entire measure by itself. You change this 4 into a 1. And now you have a whole note over here. Let's say we want 2 half ones next. And this is a 2. I made a bit of a mistake here, and this one's also a 2. Now we have 2 half notes. And then for the next measure, we want to get a little bit more fancy. Let's say 4th note first, then maybe 2 8 notes. What'll this look like? Got a couple 8 notes here. And then maybe we want some 16th notes in there too. Let's say we want 4 of them in there. That's how you can write rhythm in Lilypond. Like if you know music notation and you know what's a whole note, a half note, 4th, 8th, 16th, then it's very simple. You just write the duration immediately after the note. And so that's the basics of Lilypond. I'm actually nowhere near an expert on this yet. In fact, I've only played around with it for 1 day. So this presentation is kind of about what I learned in 1 day. And so I thought next I could show you what I've written in this 1 day. And so first I'm going to open a completely unrelated program called MuseScore, which is another, another music notation program.
I've got a question.
Yeah, sure.
Are you able to add words as well?
You are, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I actually haven't done that yet, so I don't know off the top of my head how to do that, but Lilypond text.
Oh, that's fine. You don't need to show me. I was just curious if it supported that. That's cool.
But it's also nice to show off the documentation. So, if I zoom in, it doesn't increase the size of this, but yeah. So here you have a note, and then you can write text like this. Basically, you just add a string. And as you can see over here, the documentation is really well written and really extensive. So yeah, it's there's lots of stuff out there if you want to learn Lilypond. And so I wanted to open MuseScore for a moment. And this is actually a song that I'm currently working on for my band. And what I was trying to do with Lilypond in that 1 day I was playing with it was basically to rewrite this score in Lilypond. And you can tell there's a lot more going on over here than I have in my example that I've shown you guys so far. Like on the bottom here, we have a drum staff where I have notated the drums that we're using, then bass above it, and here electric guitar. And for guitar, I have both a regular staff and also taps, which is a different way, a much easier way actually of writing down guitar music, but it's also a bit less powerful. A cool thing about Lilypond, it is also able to do taps. I haven't learned how to do it yet, but I know it's possible. And I have a brass section, a string section, lots of stuff going on here.
Sorry, can you say the name of this software again, or spell it if possible?
This one that I'm showing now?
Yes.
That's MuseScore. So MuseScore.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So let's maybe play back just a little bit of this. Okay, that's enough of that. So I wanted to try writing this in Lilypond. I didn't really get very far because It was actually at an open hack day at work, which is when we all ignore work together for a day and just program whatever we want to. And unfortunately, I had some other things I had to do. I had to interview a job applicant and solve some bugs that came up and such. But as far as I got was this.
Let me ask, how did you actually write that score that you had there? Did it just like clicking a bunch of buttons or something to get it in? I mean, how do you actually write that?
In MuseScore, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, how did you enter that?
So you push N, and then you can start clicking here.
So you click a million buttons, basically. To get
Well, that's one way to do it, but what I usually do is... So I just click on where I want it, and then I want a B, I push B.
Oh, okay.
And if I want to make a chord off of this, then let's say I want to put a major third above this, then I do Alt-3. And I want it up an octave, then Control up. Lots of shortcuts that you can use.
Interesting, okay.
And also, if you have a keyboard available, like a MIDI piano keyboard, then you can attach it to this and use that for input.
Right, that's a good idea.
Going to increase the size of this a bit. So this is as far as I got. And actually, I should probably show this compiled. Value stable, right, the PDF. So yeah, I only wrote down the verse so far, and just the guitar and the strings, none of the other instruments. But I did get like 2 tabs together. I have the tempo over here. Yeah, let's open the code next to this. So this probably looks very familiar. This is kind of what I've been explaining so far. So I'm just playing an E, 8 note, 2/16, 8, 2/16. That shows up over here like this. It's actually a song that's going to be about like crusades and knights going into battle. So this is actually a galloping rhythm. You have one a bit longer note and then 2 very fast ones. So it goes like tuk 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 tuk, kind of like galloping horse. And then down here in the string section, there's a new concept, which is 2 notes being played at the same time. And there's a couple of ways to write that in Lilypond. And over here, this is a chord. So I'm just saying, give me an E and make it an 8 note. And then also give me a B. And I write this out for everything, like an 8, 2/16, an 8, 2/16. And then for the next measure, I go down a little. I say, give me a D and also give me an A, and then the same rhythm. But this is kind of cumbersome to write it out like this. Below it, you see this chord mode, which is another way to write it. And this one I liked a lot more. Because when you have multiple notes playing at the same time, that is called a chord. And those notes are going to have a function in relation to each other. They're going to form a harmony. And basically, the way you make a chord is you first choose a root note, and then you choose a couple other notes that harmonize with it in a certain way. And all of those harmonies, they have names. They're also referred to as intervals. And so these 2 notes over here, E and B, because I know my music theory, I know that B is the perfect fifth of E. And over here, the root note is D. And A, again, I know my music theory, so I know that A is the perfect fifth of D. A root and a perfect fifth together is called a power chord. And this is how all rock music and metal music out there is constructed. It's all power chords and a whole bunch of distortion. And what this chord mode allows me to do, I can just write down the root note, and then instead of writing the next note explicitly, by typing this :5, I'm saying, please give me this note's perfect fifth. And this is much more similar to how you would actually communicate as a musician. Because when I'm talking to another guitar player, I'm not going to say, hey, can you play me an E and a B? I'm going to ask, can you play me an E power chord? And that guitarist is going to know which notes those are. It's just much easier to communicate. And if you see something like this written down, that means you're going to have to think a little, okay, which notes are these? How do they relate to each other? And then you know which chord is being played. Well, this is much simpler. Immediately you can tell this is a power chord because it's a root and it's perfect fifth. And this shows up on the staff over here. Yeah, basically the same way as here, two notes together, but written in a much nicer way. And what I have not figured out yet is a nice way to write something like this, because I don't want to write the word chord mode every time for as many notes as this in one measure. There's probably a way to do that. I just haven't found it yet.
So you can't just keep typing inside those braces? Like,
you can actually, wait, so the next measure over here. Yeah, you can actually, so sorry, I did find it, I just forgot. So here we have another chord mode, which is this measure over here. Then we say E and 2, which means the duration, half note, and it's perfect fifth. And then a D, again, half note duration, and it's perfect fifth. And we get this measure right here. So yeah, you can actually keep typing inside of those braces. I don't know why I didn't try that this time. And actually, probably the reason was because at work, when the open hack day finishes, we all get together in a call and we do presentations about what we did. And I was probably just trying to get this done in time. But one other thing that I really like about Lilypond, one of my main reasons actually for trying it out. Let me go back to MuseScore for a moment. So, at the start of my score here, I have a verse. Then when we go on, here there's a chorus. And here's another verse. The music over here is exactly the same as the first verse, only the singer will be singing different lyrics, but even his vocal melody is the same. And then when we go on a little further, another chorus. This is again exactly the same as the previous chorus. The singer will even be singing the same lyrics. If I'm working on this and I listen to a little part and I'm like, yeah, I don't quite like this part, I want to change it a little. And now I have to go to every place in the score where I have this chorus and change it everywhere. And I'm sure the programmers among us are already cringing quite a bit. Like, this is what we write functions for. So we can just change it in one place and call it in multiple places. This is a nice thing that Lilypond allows me to do. So I have a variable here called verse guitar. I assign like a block of music to it. And then here I have like score, new staff. This is my guitar staff, this one over here. And then I just call this 4 times. Because during my verse, like the vocal melody will change and some instrumentation will change, but the guitar is just doing the same thing 4 times. So I can define that once here and call it 4 times, which is very nice. And then the same goes for the strings. I also have the verse defined here. And if we scroll down, then here I'm also calling that 4 times. So yeah, that's a really cool feature, I think. I wish I had this in MuseScore. And then the final thing I want to mention, like compiling music to PDF is really nice and all. But sometimes you also want to listen to what you've written. And that's what this line over here is for. So if I compile this, let's resize my terminal a little. Lilypond and bright.cy. So this compiles to PDF, but also to a MIDI file. MIDI is basically an electronic representation of music. It's not a sound file, but it's a set of instructions. It says play this note on this instrument for this amount of time at this volume. Basically, if you have a piano keyboard at home and it's not a real piano, it's like an electronic one, that's actually what's called a MIDI interface. Like pushing down a key on there sends a MIDI command to probably an internal little embedded chip in there, which then outputs a sound to the speakers using a sound font. And a sound font, you can kind of guess it from the name, it's an implementation of a bunch of instruments. There's actually a standard on top of MIDI called General MIDI, which defines a whole bunch of instruments you can use. And in my Lilypond code over here, I have this MIDI instrument statement over here. And I'm choosing an instrument which is defined in General MIDI and saying, please use this one. And then the MIDI file that got generated, I can play back with a program called a MIDI sequencer, which is a program that reads MIDI, assigns a sound font to it, and then plays it back. So I actually have a little script here, play.sh. This uses a sequencer called Fluid Synth, and then a sound font also called Fluid. It's made by the same guys. And so this sound font will implement an overdriven guitar that I have over here. It will also implement a string ensemble. That lets me play back my MIDI file. So I'm going to give that a go, but before I do, a word of warning. This Fluid Synth, for some reason that I haven't figured out yet, sometimes starts with a lot of crackling. And that's why I left open a measure at the start over here. So it has a little time to get its bearings, but sometimes it still sounds really terrible in the beginning and then fixes itself. So we'll see how this goes. Okay, it worked. Okay, a lot more boring than what I had in MuseScore because it's just two voices and this song is supposed to have a whole bunch more going on in them. But yeah, this way I can actually compose music in this and listen to what I've done, see how it's been going. And this kind of concludes what I have to show today. Just the last thing that I want to talk about is, in conclusion, is this now going to become my composition tool of choice? I really love Lilypond. I really want it to be, but unfortunately the answer is no. The reason why is just because I think this MuseScore is still just a lot nicer to use because I don't have to compile before I make any changes, and I can say oh, I'm working on, let's say, this part right here. Let's maybe listen to that. And then think, oh, I want to change a couple of things, and then immediately listen again. It's just really nice to listen to the middle of a song. And Lilypond doesn't really allow me to do that. It gives me my MIDI file, and there's probably a way I could tell the sequencer to start at a certain measure. But I don't know, this is just a lot easier to just click and go there right away. And also, I have this mixer right here. Let's say I want to listen to just the vocal melody, then I can solo this and listen to just this, bring in other instruments as I want. Just a lot of really useful tools. And also, if I then think it's time to start practicing this on my guitar, get ready to play live, then I say I want to start from here. I click on this metronome here and it'll count me in. So I have some time to get ready with my instrument. I can also lower the tempo if I can't quite play it yet and I need to practice. So yeah, I think Lilypond is really awesome for a couple of reasons. Let me just resize this again. There's these variables that I mentioned. There's also what I didn't mention yet, the ability to store this in Git. because sometimes when I'm writing music and I've written a part that I'm not really happy with, and then I think like, oh, I want to change this, but I'm also afraid to completely mess it up and then not be able to go back anymore. And then I tend to just make a backup of the MuseScore file and then go to town on it. But yeah, sometimes I forget to clean out my source directory, and then I tend to have a lot of backups on there, and it just gets really messy. Like, I like that I can use Git on this and keep track of my changes really nicely, and sometimes go back and listen to something I had before. And there's also just the geek value. I just think it's really cool to write music as code and then compile it into the different formats that I need. But at the end of the day, for composition, I still think MuseScore is nicer. What I do think this could be very nice for is you have a piece of music that you don't need to compose, don't need to think about too much, but that you need to transcribe. Like, you just want to get it written down so you can send somebody a score. Then I think this is really nice, and in that case I might use it over MuseScore. But yeah, I think that kind of concludes my presentation. So I was wondering if there's any questions.
I have a comment.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't compose, but I do transcribe. So I use MuseScore and then use the transpose function to raise or lower the key. So I take a published work, like I have a handbell music that's in the key of G, but my handbells are in the key of F. So I want to lower it one step. So rather than doing by myself, I input the original score and then use MuseScore transpose function to drop it down one step, and then pretty up the accidentals and print it out, and makes a really nice new score for my group.
I wonder if there's something you can do in Lilypond as well.
Transpose seems like a nice UI. It seems like what it ought to do is maybe save as a Lilypond file or something like that. I mean, there's no they're kind of almost orthogonal to each other.
I think MuseScore can actually do that.
Oh, can it? I mean, do you lose any information?
PDF file, uncompressed music XML. Doesn't look like it, but I thought I saw that somewhere. Might have been some other program.
If you could save it in that kind of a format and use Git with it and all that kind of stuff, then you could maybe.
The issue may be that with it can't go. It's not fully bidirectional. You might have various function calls and things like that in Lilypond that it can't correctly translate back unless it's got the full Lilypond interpreter in it.
Yeah. Although it seems like it ought to have the function type thing or the variable type thing anyway, because it's got to be a pain, like changing your chorus, in 3 or 4 places every time you tweak the chorus.
But I think what would happen with that function is you'd get kind of the Google Translate version of Lilypond. Like, it'd be kind of correct, but it would probably be very messy. Yeah, that's also what happens when you input MIDI into MuseScore.
Or maybe you'd get the Microsoft Word HTML form of Lilypond.
Yeah. I think it would be something like that, yeah.
It would have to be done properly. I mean, they would have had to design it that way, but then, if they designed it to produce, a clean representation, that would be kind of an ideal situation, it sounds like.
Or perhaps someone will just build a visual editor for Lilypond one day.
Well, that's what I'm saying. MuseScore ought to be a visual editor for Lilypond. Kind of would be a more ideal way of having it all implemented.
Sort of feels a bit like latex or something. Latex.
Yeah, it does kind of look like that.
Yeah, it's very similar.
It is LaTeX.
It is.
Apparently, there is a graphical Lilypond editor called Denemo.
Oh, interesting. Huh?
Where is the actual Lilypond being written? This screenshot might have it. Oh yeah, here it is on the lower right.
Okay.
This could actually be cool. Yeah.
It looks a little less polished than MuseScore, but
Yeah.
Might be more programmatic or programmable in the sense that Lilypond is.
And to go back to the question a little, it does seem like you can change multiple pitches like this. But I guess this is not. This still cannot be used for transposing because this only allows you to change octaves. It seems. Oh wait, here we go. Transposing. Oh yeah. So you have apparently transpose from pitch to pitch. Actually, let's give that a try. Let's quickly copy paste this and open up TLUG over here. So. From pitch, let's say from C to B. Would this work?
How do you do sharps and flats in it, by the way?
Wait, let's first try this and then I'll get back to that. I don't know off the top of my head, but I have some in my own music. So, TLUG.
Yeah, that doesn't look like
I have
proper
some
syntax there.
Yeah. Do I have to get
You either
rid
need to get
of my
rid of the
relative?
pitch, or you need to-
Okay, I have some syntax errors. I'm not going to debug all of these right now, but apparently it is
Don't you
possible.
just take the from and to pitch out there? From pitch and
Yeah,
to
I think-
pitch are placeholders.
Yeah,
Wait,
yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
I
I
think
need
those
to
words-
From
So
Yeah,
just
just-
transpose,
just delete those.
take out the from and to pitch.
Oh, right, yeah, and also I need a bracket. Yeah, this compiles. So here's our TLUG PDF. Yeah, this transposed.
Cool.
It still bothers me a little bit that you still have like the old pitches in here, but it works. And then,
Why would-
No, that's
but
pretty much
that's what
exactly
you
what
want,
you
isn't it?
want.
yeah.
Yeah. Because
Great
do
minds.
is not necessarily C. Do is the tonic of your scale.
Depending
And that
on
could be
what
C, could
country
be
you
B
are, yeah.
flat, could be whatever.
Unless you're speaking Japanese.
Yeah, it really depends on which country you are in, which language you are speaking, whether that is
There
true.
is that. There's like fixed pitch and relative pitch, but obviously the fixed pitch people are just idiots. So
Or perfect.
Let's see. But yeah, in general, I tend to think in intervals much more than in like C, D, E, or Do, Re, Mi. I tend to think like root, minor second, major second, minor third, major third, and so on.
yeah, but that's exactly what do re mi are in the relative do re mi.
Yeah, I know.
Do mi is a major third.
Yeah, it's just a different name for the same thing. And then how to do sharps and flats.
That's a
I think
lot
I
of
had
what's
some
going
in
on
this
with MuseScore versus
Did I?
MuseScore interfaces versus Lilypond interfaces, that people just have different habits of thinking. And then, of course, MuseScore is pretty clearly written for people who aren't programmers.
Sharp pitch is made by adding IS to the name and flat by adding ES. So CIS is C sharp. Any other questions or comments?
Has anyone got a parser for Lily? I mean, obviously, all these programs that are using it have parsers, but has anyone written like a parser for a generic language so you could like do transformations and modifications to a Lilypond file?
I have no idea. I've only just played with it for one day.
Well, the whole thing is transformable into essentially a sequence of pairs of numbers, right?
Yeah, pretty
Like
much.
if you consider C to be 1, then C an octave up would be 2. The G between the two of those would be 1 plus, what's the ratio? 5/4.
So G, that would be the perfect fifth.
Yeah,
there's
5/4.
So if you go like 1 or 2 for an octave, then it's kind of difficult to subdivide all the rest. But yeah, it would be something in between there. It would be like exactly in the middle between those, I think.
No,
Or
it's...
would it, no, actually it wouldn't, no, because you have the perfect fourth and then the augmented fourth, diminished fifth as well. So, but yeah, it would be somewhere in between those two. I sometimes just feel like it's exactly in the middle because...
I'm sorry, it's 3/2 times. You're right, it is.
Yeah. Is it? Because you have 4 half steps above it to get to the next octave, but you have like I think 6 half steps below it to get to the lower root.
Well, it's logarithmic.
Oh.
And actually, technically, it depends on what intonation you're using, what tuning you're using.
Mm-hmm.
So a perfect fifth is always a perfect fifth because that's an easy 3/2 ratio. If you start with A at 440 hertz, the perfect fifth above will be 660 hertz. But once you start to get into the smaller ones, the clean ratios, like say 5/4, don't fit in neatly if you want to translate. So if you go a perfect fourth above A and then a perfect fourth above that, that's all fine. But if you shift to starting at B and you want only 12 keys per octave in your piano, those will be out slightly.
Mm. I started reading a book once about all the mathematics behind music, but I gotta admit I kind of gave up after a few chapters. But it is a cool book, and it's available for free. Like, relation between... Well, I expected it to come up right away with music and mathematics. Okay, I'm not finding it right away. Wait, is it this? I think it might be. Not sure if it was this one, but there is in any case a book that's available out there legally and free about the relation between mathematics and music. So you can just download it as a PDF. I have it on my Kindle.
Yeah, Wikipedia's got some fairly decent information on that too.
Yeah. Okay, anything else, or maybe time to stop sharing my screen?
It might be of interest to mention that this idea of scores and things like that in text is actually pretty old. And when I was in university in the mid-'80s, it was actually a fairly big thing. We'd had a couple of systems on a PDP-11. These were more into generating arbitrary sounds. So things like C music and C sound. You used to actually state things like, okay, work with these frequencies and these specific durations or things like that for weird electronic academic music. But
cool. I'm actually pretty new to music myself. When I came to Japan 11 years ago, well, I had played a little guitar back home, but I thought that was all behind me. And it's kind of here by going to music bars in Koenji that all of that came back, and then I started jamming with people and eventually writing my own music. So that stuff is long before my time. And it's cool to hear about it.
Right. Yeah, I tend to take a more pure mathematical approach to the music. I don't see any particular need to listen to it or anything like that. You can just look at the equations and the like and appreciate them.
You're probably serious though, right?
Insert the Matrix quote right here.
The Matrix has some good music. Well, the first one.
Yeah, if you want to sit down over a beer one day and chat about it, though, I'd be happy to sit down with whatever reference and walk you through bits of it.
Yeah, that would probably be cool. Maybe at the TLUG Nomikai, when those finally start happening again.
Yeah.
I should mention, by the way, that all of these ratios and things, like an octave is defined as simply doubling. So middle C to the C above is just double the frequency. And of course, we've talked about the perfect fifth, which is a 3/2 ratio. But timbre, i.e. the type of sound, is also defined completely in that way. You can take whatever this weird sound is and do what's called a fast Fourier transform to break it down into its set of sine waves. And the set of sine waves for square wave, for example, will be different amplitudes from the set of sine waves for a triangle wave. Square wave would be alternate octaves up. But when you combine them all together, it just sounds like one tone with a very different timbre rather than a chord.
Nice. Yeah, I've also played around with Sonic Pi a bit. Might remember me presenting that in TLUG before. A Ruby language where you can play samples and play certain notes and stuff. Code your own music and put in some randomized elements. Also pretty cool.
Yeah. They had a book for that, didn't they? I couldn't. Last time I looked, I think they were all sold out or they don't exist anymore or something.
There is definitely a book for that, and actually somebody brought it to my TLUG presentation about it.
Yeah.
And also that presentation indirectly got me my current job at DigiCan. Because when it was over, I remember saying, hey, if anybody has another community where they want me to do this talk, then please talk to me, I'll do it. And one of DigiCa's employees came over and said, hey, come do this at our company. That's how I found them.
Cool.
So I had a question that maybe you can't answer. One of my interests in this is that I take care of music for the church, and a lot of times you get a PDF and it takes 3 pages or 2 pages or something like that. And I would like to change the layout enough so that it fits on 1 page, because the people who are using it are probably on a mobile.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'd like it all be there in their face. Do you have control over layout in Lilypond?
I think you
things
probably
together,
do, considering how powerful it is. Let's see.
Okay.
Lilypond page layout. Let me quickly Google that. Oh yeah, I immediately find the documentation that says page layout. There's apparently a paper block. Oh, and in there you can write stuff like top margin and a unit of size unit.
If people are using like
you have control over this.
Maybe the HTML would be better, like a web page and PDF.
The MuseScore has page layout and you can squish the stuff together. It has some options like that to control the layout.
Does, yeah. And MuseScore can also import PDFs and do its best at interpreting them. I haven't tried yet how good it is at that, but it does have that feature.
I haven't tried either.